Web of Lies. Epilogue. When they returned to the island of Sodor, both engines were given thorough inspections at the works. Diesel was the worst for wear, having half-melted his axle boxes in anger on more than a few occasions, and overclocked his engine terribly in a vain attempt to prove that he was a long-distance contender. Thomas, on the other hand, had fared remarkably well. But that was no surprise to anybody. His resilience was well known to everybody on Sodor. It also helped that Marcel and Maxine had so vigilantly tended to his bearings and joints. Even halfway across England, he had been well maintained and kept in fine running condition. But all the same, he couldn't go back to his branch line just yet, not before he was summoned to Tidmouth station. Thomas was nervous. He knew who would be waiting for him on the platform there. But he didn't get that far before a chorus of whistles ambushed him from the sheds. "Well, look who it is," cackled James with feeling.
"Oh, thank heavens you're all right," cried Henry. "You must know I'd never intended to leave you behind." "Quite a stunt you pulled," bellowed Gordon. "Tidmouth to London in 7 days. Now, don't take this the wrong way, my boy, but if the Wild Nor'wester made such time, it would never sell another ticket."
Thomas's eyes darted every which way, unsure whether to feel excited or insulted or just glad to be home. He settled on a mixture of all three. "Boy, have I got stories for you all," he chuckled at last.
"Visit anywhere of note?"
asked Gordon with vicarious interest. "We never went to Doncaster, if that's what you're asking."
"Oh, no, certainly not. It'd be far too off course. But, perhaps King's Cross?"
It was then that Edward sauntered up from within the sheds, with perfect calm. His eyes twinkled when they saw Thomas, but he didn't look all that surprised. "Oh, hello. You made rather good time. Enjoy your little adventure?" Thomas just smirked. Edward had clearly never doubted his safety. Whether that was because he knew the true nature of the other railway, or he had faith in Thomas's survival instincts, he wasn't sure. But either way, it was good to see him. "Immensely," smiled Thomas. "Maybe a little too much. The whole thing was a terrible mix-up after all." "Well, I'm glad you made the most of it," grinned the old engine. "We've been hearing all the news. Your face is all over the telly." But all 5 engines were made inaudible by the 6th. "Thomas!" He squealed alongside the sheds and skidded to a halt beside his friend. "You're alive! You're alive! You're alive! You're alive!" Thomas only shot a playful jet of steam at him. "Of course I'm alive, silly. And better than that, I'm enriched. I think I may be more well-traveled than you now." But everybody knew that wasn't true. Percy the small engine had worked in so many factories, it'd be no surprise if one of them was on the moon. The celebrations were cut short by the thunderous clearing of a throat. Somehow, despite the incredible volume of all 6 engines rumbling at once, they all heard the man standing on the edge of Tidmouth platform, half a mile away. His presence was simply that undeniable.
"Oh dear," gulped Henry. "You had better go and see him."
The anxiety returned to Thomas's boiler, his cylinders filled with steam again. But Edward spoke softly to him as he went. "Don't fret. It's going to be all right." He seemed to know something. Sir Stephen Topham Hatt stood motionless on the platform. His hands were clasped behind his back. His posture was impeccable. When Thomas came creeping up to the platform, the man gestured firmly to the very back of the station, where the platform ended in buffers. They were taking this into his office. Thomas came to a halt in the deepest part of the big station. Sir Stephen Hatt stood before him expectantly. "Sir, well, okay, sir, I can explain."
"Can you now?"
He was so composed. His father before him had been quite haughty when his engines defied him. His grandfather had been a terror. But Stephen was cool and collected. Always. To Thomas, it made him the most intimidating of the 3. When Thomas opened his mouth, he didn't close it again till the entire story was out. I was trying to stop Diesel, sir, and then we ended up in Manchester, and he said that there were evil, prowling Diesels blocking the way home, so we went the southern route instead, but that didn't make any sense, and I said it was foolish, but then I found out how well liked I am the whole country over, and, well, I couldn't disappoint the people, could I? So we carried on blowing whistles and signing autographs, and before I knew it, we were in London. That was a blast from the past, let me tell you. And then Diesel dared me on to Southampton, and Lord forgive me, I could never say no to a dare, so then he told me it had all been a lie, and Thomas finally took a breath. Several, in fact. And that's when we called you. The Fat Controller stared for a long time. When Thomas's confidence had finally been unbalanced, the great man allowed himself to smile.
You silly engine. I've known all along.
Thomas was aghast. The Fat Controller really did know everything. But then something occurred to Thomas, and he was very cross. Well, why didn't you tell us?
You didn't tell me either, the Controller harumphed. Fair's fair.
Thomas frowned. The Fat Controller had a point.
But, as much as I'd like to say so, I'm not all-knowing. I received a tip.
And to Thomas's shock, he tipped his hat to Maxine and Marcel. It dawned on the tank engine what he was implying. He glared daggers at his crew. No! You didn't! Marcel shrugged. Oh, come now, Thomas. We'd have been fired by now if we hadn't. How long? The tank engine demanded. Oh, not long, grinned Maxine cheekily. Since your big reveal at the colliery. Thomas was speechless. A lot of things were starting to make sense now. The signalmen had become rather lenient after they'd left Nottingham. Thomas had assumed they were letting him through because he was such a splendid engine. That seemed rather silly in hindsight. I felt bad about it at first, confessed Maxine, and then I remembered how much you love adventure. It would have been cruel to reveal to you it was only a tour. Thomas's safety valve slowly simmered down. He tried to fight it, but he couldn't help grinning. His driver and fireman knew him too well. It had indeed been a lot of fun playing the rebel for a while. The Fat Controller continued.
There's another reason I left you in the dark, Thomas.
And he reached into his jacket, producing the same newspaper Thomas had seen blowing through Victoria Yards.
I wanted to see how you would do on tour, so to speak. A baseline, if you will. With no advertisement whatsoever. Only your mere presence.
Thomas just blinked in surprise, then grinned cheesily. And how did I do, sir?
You're a lousy planner,
he said firmly.
But I knew that already. However, the people love you, so I want to try it again.
Thomas gasped. Sir!
You are becoming something of an icon, Thomas. Your little stint across the country has only fanned the flames. After all, if you could entertain the masses by accident, imagine what you could do on purpose.
Well, I suppose I did put on quite a show. He was quickly warming to the idea.
People want to see more of you. Are you ready to see them?
We all know how Thomas responded, and I'm sure you can guess what came next. But that's another story.
I will make the arrangements,
said Sir Topham Hatt, who could not fully hide his own excitement. Thomas remained at the platform, still a little stunned from everything that had transpired over the last week. As the Fat Controller disappeared into his office, the tank engine sat and simmered, thinking it all over. His thoughts were interrupted by the rumbling of express bogie wheels and a boxy green tank engine backing toward him. Duck positioned the coaches precisely in Platform 2, and then backed up to run around the train. But he stopped when he saw Thomas.
You're on the crossover,
Duck informed Thomas politely. No, welcome back, Thomas sniffed.
Oh, of course. Welcome back.
He said it with much love, it's not that he didn't, but he really needed to use that crossover.
Now, if you'd be so kind.
Thomas rolled his eyes and made some space. So, you're marshalling coaches then? Duck settled in next to Thomas, well clear of the train. He seemed to loosen a little now that his task was complete.
Somebody had to,
he said dutifully. Any chance you ran my branch for me, too? Thomas chuckled. Duck only smirked in loving disapproval, but his face fell when he was reminded of something else.
Did they get Paddington sorted out?
He said it with urgency. Thomas smiled, rather compassionately. Yeah, I think so. When we left, most of the lines were clear. They were running some trains. Duck exhaled so heavily, it sounded like he'd been holding his breath for a week.
Good.
And that's all he could bear to say on the matter. His relief was obvious.
You've had quite the week, the Great Western engine continued. I'm glad you're all right.
It was a simple sentence, but he said it with such sincerity. Thomas had missed honesty and earnestness the last week. He chuckled. Oh, please. British Rail was no match for me. I was never in any danger. Duck kept his lips closed for some time before answering.
Your disregard for railway protocol was, disturbing to hear about. But that's not what I'm talking about.
And he inched closer, almost whispering.
He took you for a ride, didn't he?
Thomas's grin vanished. His cheeks pinkened slightly. Who, Diesel?
Who else?
Thomas mulled over whether he should be candid with Duck or not. He wondered if Duck would hold his foolhardiness over him. And then he remembered that this was Duck. He never held anything over anybody. Yeah, he played me for a fool. And as he confronted what had happened for the first time, he became angrier at himself. I know the shape of England. How could I let him convince me that bloody Southampton was the best way home? Duck was sympathetic, maybe even empathetic.
Don't blame yourself, Thomas. Diesel may be a rotten shunter, and a rottener engine on the whole, but he's a brilliant manipulator.
I suppose he is, Thomas said sadly. You were right to be wary of him. He was 10 steps ahead the whole time somehow.
He's a villain, plain and simple.
Well, Thomas interjected. Duck's eyebrows rose high.
Well?
I have just spent a lot of time with him. And he's got problems, Duck, make no mistake. I mean, the way he sees the world is so cynical. Thomas took a deep breath, and then made his point at last. But I don't think he's evil.
He would have marooned you in Southampton, Duck reminded. He only cares about himself. The only thing that engine cares about is his own survival.
Thomas thought back, still looking conflicted. Has he ever talked to you about Derby? Duck just looked confused.
The loco works? Well, no, he's never mentioned it.
Thomas sighed. Maybe you should ask. But Duck would never get the chance. Diesel never returned to Tidmouth Station. The adventure had changed him. He simply refused to work, so they sent him to the Diesel Works. They couldn't find a thing wrong with him. There wasn't a broken part in his whole body. That, of course, was because it was his mind that was troubled. Most engines don't have minds. They let their boilers or motors do the thinking for them. But for some cursed reason, it seemed that Diesel did. And now, as he sat nestled in a dark corner of the Vickerstown Diesel Works, he would use that mind to think and dwell and lament. He'd never had the humility to grab hold of all the olive branches thrust his way. He'd trimmed and clipped and swatted at every one. Now he was alone, with his broken ideologies. And as much as he hated this outcome, he wouldn't have it any other way. In this rotten world, where modernization had been bastardized and steam romanticized, he had no place. He would never be able to change it. The revolution wasn't dead, but it only had one supporter now. And so he blended in, and was forgotten, just as he had always wanted.